Phil Reames here. Welcome to another edition of Interviews with Industry Leaders. Today our special guest is Dr. Gary Wolfram. Dr. Wolfram is the William E. Simon Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Hillsdale College, which happens to be my daughter Leah's alma mater. Dr. Wolfram has a new book out called A Capitalist Manifesto, Understanding the Market Economy and Defending Liberty. Dr. Wolfram, welcome. How you doing today?
Well, great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Are you having a good Christmas, good holiday season?
We had a very good Christmas. My two older children were both in with my youngest one. In fact, we watched my youngest one had his 17th birthday yesterday, and he played a basketball game against Jonesville High School, and we all went out bowling with the basketball team players, and we had a really good time.
Oh, very cool, very cool. And did they win their game against Jonesville?
Unfortunately, they lost, but it was 80 to 75, so it was quite a high-scoring high school game, so it was very fun to watch.
Excellent.
My son would prefer to win for his birthday, of course, but...
Well, of course. Well, excellent. Well, before we get into the book, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background. From what I understand, you got your PhD from Berkeley, which is a pretty liberal school, and then you end up at Hillsdale College, one of the most conservative schools in the nation. How the heck does that happen?
Well, like the Grateful Dead said, what a long, strange trip it's been. I grew up in California. I went to UC Santa Barbara as an undergraduate, and then went on to Berkeley, and then I got my first teaching job was at Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts. It was a one-year visiting position, but I was young and I had never seen the East Coast. So, took that and, actually met my wife there. So that was a good thing.
Very cool.
And then, came to Michigan the next year and was at University of Michigan Dearborn for a couple of years. Took some leave, taught at Washington State University. Then I got involved came back to Michigan, and then I got involved in the political arena in terms of public policy. I worked for John Engler when he was in the Senate here in Michigan as the economist for Republican senators, and that sort of got me very heavily into the public policy arena. And then I got the job at Hillsdale College, then took another leave, two more leaves actually, one to be the deputy state treasurer in Michigan, where I learned what's going on in the executive branch. And then later I took a leave to be Congressman Nick Smith, chief of staff out in Washington, D.C. So that gave me a whole background in how the political arena works and the fact that you really need to win the battle of ideas, that congressmen or state senators or governors are not going to do something that they at least can't explain to their constituency. So you have to either demonstrate to the congressman, okay, yes, here's how you can explain this, or you have to go out and help them explain to the constituents. And it all became sort of the same idea as teaching. I mean, that's sort of what we do at Hillsdale College, is we focus on teaching. So eventually I thought, well, why confine myself to that? Why not write a book that serves to teach the average person out there, that they can, even if they have a decent understanding, they can maybe learn a little bit more so that they can explain it to someone else. Or they can have something that they can give to someone else that's readable, that's maybe engaging, that they can then talk to the other people about. So that's sort of how I ended up writing the book in the end, was through my actually all that I did in the political arena seemed to be teaching as well.
Okay. Well, and I'm guessing then that the little thing that Professor Rolfe used to make you guys do has really come in handy for you then, hasn't it? That
yes,
being able to tell those stories.
Yes, that's, I mentioned in the book that Earl Rolfe was a well-known professor at Berkeley, but was sort of old school, what we might call old school today, did not get involved that much in the mathematical modeling. After someone would have a really detailed mathematical model, Earl would say, okay, now tell me a story about why that's true. And oftentimes they couldn't tell a very good story. They had the math down, but they couldn't tell a story. And at the time we sort of thought Earl was just not up on the math. But once I got into the political arena, I could see, oh my gosh, I mean, you really need to be able to tell a story, because the average person that is just watching the news, or the average person that is going to that voting booth, they are not going to be interested in the mathematics. They want to know the story. And so that sort of, I think, is a mark of a true teacher, is someone who can tell you a story about why that happens. I mean, now that I think about it, I hadn't thought about this before until just now, but I mean, that's what parables are about, right? I mean, that's what Jesus would do in the Bible. He'd tell a story.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. I think it's an effective teaching tool.
I agree. I love the stories you use in the book. And in fact, Leah said that she loved taking your classes because you do such a good job of taking hard concepts and using those stories to make it easy for people to understand. Now, you mentioned Mount Holyoke. Is that where the story in the book about the bus and the bus fares and all that?
Yes, it is.
Kind of where that came from?
Yes, it is. So it was, Mount Holyoke was part of a 5-college consortium they were all about 10 or 15 miles from one another, and there was a free bus that went around to the different colleges and took students from one school to another, and that's where the story about where the student told me about having to get off the bus because there was too many people on the bus to make it up the hill. And then, of course, there was another young professor there with me, and we began to talk about, okay, well, how would you do that? How would you allocate the seats on the bus if you had this similar situation, and what was the most effective way of doing that? And that makes up basically the bigger story of how do you allocate resources and what's the most efficient way to do that.
Okay, excellent. Well, what is the single most important thing that you would like people to understand from your book?
Well, I think that to understand that there's this marvel, which is the market economy, that allocates goods and services according to what the consumer wants, and makes it so that there's always the right amount of stuff out there. I tell my students, 9 million people woke up today in New York City, and there's exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee and exactly the right amount of bagels and exactly the right amount of toilet paper and everything else. And yet no one's in charge. How can that possibly be? Because our instinct, I think, is to think that someone should be in charge. But we know when someone is in charge, there's not going to be the right amount of it. We can see that with Hurricane Sandy, where they had the lines for gasoline. Why were there lines for gasoline but not lines for toilet paper? Because there was a law that said the market price couldn't exist. It was an anti-price gouging. And so when the price can't set the demand and supply being equal to one another, then what happens is there's other ways of sorting it out, namely standing in line waiting for things. You saw the same thing in 1973 during the Arab oil embargo when there was a law against letting the price rise to equilibrium. And so we had huge lines and they had rationing and everything else. And it went away instantly when the federal government finally gave in and said, let's just let the price work. So I think that's the focus on this, is that this requires individual liberty. This requires that we be free to choose what goods we want to buy, free to choose how we're going to sell our labor services, free to choose whether we're going to take on this risk and undertake an investment, free to choose to be able to give our money to someone else to allow them to go out and take that risk, and in return then we get a part of the company or the like. So I think the main thing is that we need to observe how wondrous this market system is, and as we start to call for government intervention, this is going to create unintended consequences, which led, for example, to the housing crisis. I mean, you go back, what happened? Well, you had the government intervening in interest rates. You had the government intervening in the housing industry. And so you got more housing built than there could be the market to sustain. And we ended up with the financial crisis that occurred. So you can really look back, I think, to most of these problems in business cycles are government caused. Because why would it so that so many people overbuilt housing. You can see some people overbuilding. You can see some companies overbuilding. But why is it that millions of people are overbuilding? Well, it's got to be that they've been given the wrong signal. And so that, we need to not keep looking towards government to solve our problems. One of the things I talk about in the book is a guy named Bastiat that wrote in 1850 that was called The Law. Then he said, the solutions to the problem of human relations are to be found in individual liberty. And that's really what we need. If there's a problem out there, then we need to go back to community, go back to the Elks Club and the Lions Club and our Catholic Relief Services and Doctors Without Borders and solve the problem through individual liberty.
Okay. Well, what you just said brings to mind one of the shortages I've been seeing for the last 12 to, maybe 24 months. We're starting to see news articles about shortages of certain medicines. And I don't ever remember that being the case growing up my whole lifetime. But now we look at how involved in healthcare the government is getting, and all of a sudden there's shortages.
Oh, sure. I mean, the healthcare industry, which is, of course, the one that we're more and more of our GDP is being directed towards healthcare, and we don't seem to get particularly much better healthcare services in other places that the government's not so intervening in. But it's the way I put it is, when you go to take someone out to dinner, when do you tell them you're picking up the tab? And the answer is after they've ordered. Now, our healthcare system is not only do we know that you're picking up the tab, the waiter knows that you're picking up the tab. So the waiter comes out with a $100 bottle of wine, and you, of course, say, okay, I'll take that, and then someone else has to get stuck with paying for it. So what are the incentives now? The incentives to take care of the elderly. The incentives are to produce a good that's extremely expensive, doesn't particularly help you, but will be paid for by Medicare. So rather than directing resources into inexpensive, efficient ways of improving the health of the elderly, we drive it into very expensive ways of driving healthcare costs for the elderly because Medicare pays for it. We've all seen the ad for the scooter on television. We've never seen an ad that says, here's how much this costs. And I will tell you, you and I would not be surprised if that scooter cost $60,000.
Yeah.
We wouldn't, right? Because
right.
It's not going to be paid for by that person that's driving the scooter around. It's going to be paid for by the government. Then it's going to have to be paid for by the government's going to require the private health insurance to pay for it. And so we end up with hugely expensive healthcare costs. Well, then this unintended consequence of government intervention. Well, then we say, oh my gosh, no one can make it without health care, health insurance. We're going to require everybody to buy health insurance, or we're going to require every company to provide health insurance, or we're going to have a government health insurance company, which is what Medicare and Medicaid are. I mean, to really think about it, they're government health insurance companies, and they're the drivers of the costs of health care out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, on page 90, you make the statement, the rise of the middle class was the inevitable outcome of the rise of capitalism. And I believe that to be a true statement. I agree with you. But there are a lot of people in this country right now that actually believe just the opposite. They believe that capitalism is destroying the middle class. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I think this all goes back down to a fundamental misunderstanding of how markets work and how capitalism works. Capitalism is not big business gets together with big government to get whatever they want. Capitalism is a system based on voluntary exchange. It's a system where the ownership of resources is held privately, not by the government. And so people confuse when government can intervene in the economy, making you buy things you might not otherwise buy, or making you do things you might otherwise not do. They confuse that with how markets work. That's really how government works. So if I know that government can force you to buy an electric car, and I'm a battery maker for electric cars, of course, what do? I'll start contributing to your campaigns, and I'll start getting involved in politics, and And pretty soon what's going on is there's what is called rent seeking in the academic literature. What will happen is you'll have all these companies intervening in the political process because their resources are better used there than producing stuff for consumers. So it's really the fact that government can intervene in the system that causes all this coordination between big government and big business. And it's interesting that Bastiat, that I was referring to earlier, in 1850 spoke of the same thing. He said, once government engages in legalized plunder, government can take from you and give to me. He says that what will happen is that the plundered classes will attempt to engage in the making of the law. And so we observe that today in costing $1 billion to run for president, in super PACs, in lobbying firms. And why is all that happening? It's all happening because government can engage in legalized plunder. If the government couldn't do those sorts of things, then people would be devoted towards producing stuff for other people. And really, when you think about how can you get rich in a market system, in a market system, the only way to get rich in a market system is to produce something that other people want, right? I can't force you to buy that iPad. I can't force you to buy that iPhone. And Steve Jobs didn't know when he went to take on that huge risk of making these things and making the machines that make these things. He really didn't know that we were all going to want to buy it. He undertook that risk, and he was successful. And because he was successful, and millions of people have these iPhones and iPads and everything else, he got really rich. And what you're going to observe in a market system is that the more people that I can sell to, the wealthier I can get. If we open up a market so that China has 1.3 billion consumers that we couldn't sell to before, then whoever can think of things that will please 1.3 billion Chinese, they're going to get really rich. In the old days, you could only sell to 330 million people, or you could sell to people in Europe, but you couldn't sell to the 1 billion Indians and the 1.3 billion Chinese. And now, of course, what will happen is the rich will get very, very rich. But the only reason they got very, very rich is because they're selling to billions of people. They're making a product that billions of people want. I always say to people, I'm going to give a lecture. I'll say, how many out there have ever used a Microsoft product? Well, everybody raises their hand. Then I say, how many people have ever paid to listen to me speak? And a few will raise their hand and say, that's why Bill Gates is rich and I'm not. Just that simple. Now, if 50 million people really like my book and go out and buy it, guess what? I'll be rich. But I can't force them to buy it. So the only way that I can get rich by writing this book is if I please lots and lots and lots of people.
Okay. Well, on Facebook, I have a lot of friends, not all of whom believe capitalism is a good thing. So the other day I just posted a little thing and said, hey, what are your questions or criticisms of capitalism? One of them I got was what one person sees as the inequality of wealth, that it's not fair for some people to get really rich like that. Well, how would you respond to that?
Well, one of the things I talk about in the book as well is this, what Mises wrote about in his little book in 1927 called Liberalism and the Classical Tradition. And one of the foundations of basically market capitalism, individual liberty is inequality of wealth. And you're going to get inequality of wealth because of what I talked about. Bill Gates is going to be very much wealthier than I am. Why? Because he went out and figured out a product that billions of people wanted. I didn't do that. So I have to accept the responsibility that why am I not rich? I'm not rich because I didn't produce something that millions and millions of people want. But you know what? I'm really rich compared to people in other countries that don't operate under market capitalism. The question isn't really about inequality. The question is about how wealthy are the poor. If you're the poorest, if I said to you, I'm God and you're going to be placed in any country that you want, but here's the caveat, you're going to be the poorest person there. You're not going to say, okay, send me to North Korea. Send me to Cuba. I want to be the poorest person in Venezuela. You don't want to be that. You want to be the poorest person in a market capitalist system, because in market capitalist systems, it's so efficient. and making wealth, that the poorest are actually much wealthier. And if you really thought about it, Bill Gates, yes, he's very much wealthier than I am. But you know what? My lifestyle is really not a lot different. I wake up in a house that's got heating. I've got indoor plumbing. I've got a car. He's got a car. Maybe my car's not as nice as his. Maybe he's got more cars than I do. But if I want to fly to California, I fly on an airplane. He flies on an airplane. Now, maybe he has his own private plane, and it's more convenient. But really, there's not a huge difference between my lifestyle and Bill Gates' lifestyle. The difference between my lifestyle and someone living in a refugee camp in Somalia is enormously different. And I think that's what we need to focus on. Not that what Mises called the politics of envy. Not that, oh yeah, Bill Gates has got all this stuff and I have less stuff than he does. It's a matter of how did he get wealthy only by pleasing other people? And how can we make it so that the poorest among us are living as a lifestyle that is well improved from what it was? You know, I say to my students, what would you rather be, King of England in 1263 or yourself? I'm sure Leah said, I'd rather be Leah, right?
Sure.
I want to be King of England in 1263. There's no running water. There's no indoor plumbing. There's no heating, you know. And why is it? It's because we changed the system by which we produce. We didn't all of a sudden get a lot smarter, get new DNA, any of that stuff. What happened was we altered the system to a market capitalist system from a feudal system.
Okay. All right. Well, let's shift gears here as we wrap up. Right now, there's a lot of talk about the fiscal cliff. Big deal or not a big deal, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a pretty big deal in the sense that your savings, if you have invested in equities, that the stock market is reacting poorly to it. And the reason is because the tax increases that are going to happen are going to slow economic growth. Will it destroy the economy? No. Will it make it so that we have 20% unemployment? No. But will it make it so that we get very little economic growth? Yes, that's what's going to happen. But it's not so much the fiscal cliff, but what led to the fiscal cliff. What led to the fiscal cliff is you have Social Security and Medicare, which are entitlement programs that are unsustainable in their current structure and need to be changed structurally. And there is, because people don't understand how those programs work, there's a lot of political trouble trying to deal with that. And huge deficits that the government has run up that's really the fundamental problem. You know, we don't have a tax problem, we have a spending problem. And even if you look, when people say, well, gee, the Clinton tax rates were as high as these will go up to if the fiscal cliff happens. But the other thing is that the size of government was declining during the Clinton era once the Republicans got control of government or got control of the House. And so relative to GDP, you had a decline in federal government spending relative to GDP. You don't have that right now. Right now, you still have an increasing amount of government spending relative to GDP. That's your real problem. And the fiscal cliff is a symptom, I think, of the problem. That is, there's political gridlock, and the political gridlock is coming about because you need the House and Senate and President to make changes in these major entitlement programs, and you don't have that.
Right. And, you know, politicians, in seminars, I used to always ask, what is a politician's number one job? And the response I got the most was to get reelected, which is a pretty cynical view, but I think it's true. And it's one of the reasons I don't really think we will see this thing solved until we become Greece. I just can't find in history an example of another country that has put themselves in this position that have voluntarily stepped back and fixed the problem, because there's always somebody else willing to come in and continue promising to give the people things. Well, let's go ahead and wrap up here. Let me see. What do you think is the single biggest threat to the economy going forward?
Well, to tell you the truth, I think the greatest threat is losing the battle of ideas. I mean, really, the key is yes, but the politician will vote to fix Medicare and turn it into basically a voucher program and make it so that that when I go out, I decide if I have to have a blood test, I ask the question, how much does that cost? And that can happen, but people have to understand how markets work and to think that through. And if you don't win the battle of ideas, then it's very hard to make these changes. But I think that you can. I mean, that's what Hillsdale College does. That's what you're doing. I mean, that's what the book is about. It's all about trying to win that battle of ideas. And I think that 2014 is going to be a much better outlook than we're looking at in 2012. Because in 2014, there's a lot of people going into the polling booths or into the voting booths in 2012 voting for president that are voting for the president because they want to elect somebody they're going to like. And I think that was really what this was all about. What was Obama's campaign? You're not going to like that Mitt Romney guy. He's not cute. He drives around with a dog on top. More people knew that he drove around with a dog on top of his car than knew anything about what his plans for Medicare or Social Security were. And so I think you get more in the off-year elections, people who have a better idea about what's going on in terms of the policies. So I think that 2014 is going to be a key year. And if we win the battle of ideas, and we can make strides in that, then we can work at Medicare, Social Security, and these budget deficits. And they're really, it's really, I think, that the inability of Americans to accept responsibility for their actions that is the threat to the economy, more than any particular fiscal policy or monetary policy, because we can get correct fiscal and monetary policy if people understand how the whole system works.
Right. Oh, great answer. Great answer. I love that. And I think your book will be a great tool in helping us do that. So, folks, Dr. Wolfram's book is a great read, and I do highly recommend it. You can purchase it by going to the link that's right below the video in the newsletter. Dr. Wolfram, thank you very much for making time in your holiday schedule to talk with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and you have a Happy New Year.
You too. Well, folks, that wraps up another edition of Interviews with Industry Leaders. Until next time, protect your wealth.